Thank everybody. I'm going to start again. So I want to thank everybody for not only giving me this platform to speak to you all, but I know your days are busy. So thanks for your participation in this. My name is Trevor Morgan, and I head up enterprise product marketing at Comforte for our data security platform. And my colleague, Thomas Glowerfeld, who I think is not able to be here today, asked me to speak to you all about zero trust. So it's a talk about a pretty increasingly important trend, but I'm painfully aware of the fact that trend may not be the right word. Is it a methodology? Is it a paradigm? Is it a set of best practices? Is it a framework? Choose whatever one works for you. It could be all of the above. I had to do a lot of research on this topic, not only because I was simply very curious about it, but we were being asked the question quite often, are you zero trust compliant, which is an interesting way to phrase it, or where do you stand in reference to zero trust, or what do you think about zero trust? And I wanted to develop a means to tie in data-centric security, which is what I focus on, to the zero trust methodology. So in so doing, lots of research, talking to analysts, talking to engineers, talking to CISOs, to try to develop a message that really makes sense, because a lot of this can be pretty technical. And you can get into the technical weeds pretty quickly and try to win some sort of technical argument, none of which I'm going to try to do here. What I really want to do is raise awareness at a fairly high level and talk about zero trust, but from a particular angle and how it relates specifically to data, which in many ways is considered just one component of zero trust. So that in particular is what's interesting to me, and I realize I've set the bar really low so that as long as I just chat with you for 20 minutes, this is a success. But I say that tongue in cheek. I really hope that this sets up some of the other conversations that are going to be occurring on zero trust. So zero trust is not necessarily a technical topic or a technical shift or some sort of technical implementation, or at least it's not necessarily primarily a technical endeavor. It is very much a shift in outlook, in organizational demeanor, in your organizational and technical posture that all gets reflected in your controls and your tooling. And don't take it from me. And by the way, if you haven't, and we're going to talk about what zero trust is, but if you really want to get into the literature, you're eventually going to wind up looking at the U.S. Department of Defense's framework. The U.S. NIST has publications. There are a lot of publications out there. What I found interesting, and I've actually worked with the DoD in the past, in my past life, is that you'd think this was a hardcore technical explanation. They just come out and say that this is a dramatic shift in philosophy in terms of how you secure your infrastructure, your network, and your data. So you're kind of seeing here why I'm going to keep this at that philosophical level, for at least part of it. So we know why the philosophy and the framework is important, because we hear about the drivers that are causing people to question us about zero trust. We hear them all the time. And the drivers should be apparent to all of you all. Whether you're talking about expanding attack surfaces, especially as organizations not only push into the cloud, but get increasingly complex with cloud native, hybrid cloud architectures, multi-cloud. This is spreading out the attack surfaces that potentially threat actors can manipulate. A lot of high profile breaches, that just creates a general pause so that people think, hey, I wonder if this zero trust can prevent us from having that high profile pause. As I said, cloud architectures in all of their different manifestations, and also the narrow tools and methods that I don't want to call them traditional, but that focus only on borders and perimeters. It seems as though many organizations start there and often don't move too far past that. And those in particular, while being very valuable to the organization, aren't necessarily, and by the way, I was going to time this, so I'm going to keep an eye on the timer. They aren't necessarily appropriate to head off all of these drivers. So people are looking for more than just the border and perimeter security. They're wondering, what can I do beyond that? But I think we have to recognize, I think all of us on this call know that the border alone isn't the end all be all. And that's why I've got that picture there. There's always a way around it. They'll always be penetrated. Threat actors are patient. They're driven by gain. We'll talk about that too in a minute. They're crafty. If they want entry into an environment, and I don't mean to be alarmist, chances are, given enough time, a little bit of social engineering or whatever, they're going to find a way through it, around it, over it, under it. Pick your favorite preposition, doesn't matter. So this really starts to bring up a side issue of zero trust, which is, are we after prevention of access, prevention of breaches, prevention of leaks? Or are we trying to do everything we can to mitigate and gum up the machinery so that even if compromised, I'll call them assets for now, compromised assets fall into the wrong hands, the impact is mitigated? I'm not going to answer that right now, but it's something just to keep in mind. Move to the next slide here. This is really a gross simplification of the methodology. And as I say, please go to all the literature out there, but this is my summarization of it just to make it easy. Don't give implicit trust. Continually assess who has access to what, and continually do that. Don't just do it once and then sure, come on in. Restrict access to anything based upon a proven beyond a shadow of a doubt need. And also start with the least privileges and don't go one budge beyond that, again, until you reassess and reassess and reassess. So this is really, to me, the core principles that I drew away from all of that research. But more importantly, what do you do with it? Well, I mean, there are frameworks out there. The US DoD gives you a framework. There are other frameworks out there. Analysts will give you a framework. Ultimately, you're going to have to take these principles and some of the others and create your own assessment. But this is at the center of all zero trust conversations that I know. And it really is that first one. Don't give implicit trust. But it really brings up the valuable question to our prospects and customers, and the difficult question for all of us vendors. Great, I'm all in. Where do I start? Where do you start? And that's really what I want to address for the remainder of this discussion, is that zero trust is so very wide and broad and touches the entire IT infrastructure that where to start often, and I'm going to just lay my cards down a little bit, it often depends upon who you're asking. What vendor are you asking? If I go down to the BMW dealership and I say, what is the best fast sedan I can buy? I'm sure I'm going to be shown all of the BMWs before somebody starts talking about, I don't know, Corvettes. So, not that that's a sedan. But anyway, I think you get the picture there that I want to address. Where should you start if you're an organization going, hey, I really like this concept. I want to stick my toe into that pool, so to speak. So in 2018, the US Congress held a subcommittee. They do a lot of talking, way more than I do. And this subcommittee had a bunch of cybersecurity experts in, and they were talking about different aspects of the economic impact of breaches. And one of the things, and by the way, if you ping me afterwards, if you want to know what testimony this is, there's a nice document out there. It's really fascinating stuff, because you have experts talking to non-experts, and it puts it plain and simple. Well, what are all these people after? If you're telling me some are state-sponsored, some are not, some have a grudge against this group, that group, is there a common denominator? The common denominator, data. Data. They don't want your wireless router. They don't want your server. They want, for whatever purpose they have, they are after data. That is the sole focus. Why? Well, the points are right up there. They want to get into your environment. They want to get to that data, and whether they want to leverage it for gain, monetize it, sometimes they'll weaponize it, whatever the case, they want to get the data, then do something typically not so friendly with that data. You're hearing a word coming up over and over and over, and it takes us back to the previous slide. Where to start? Data, data, data. They're after your data. So moving past that point, I always like to defend an assertion with another defense of it. NIST, from a completely different perspective in their special publication, says virtually the same thing. If we're going to look at zero trust as an approach to preventing the ramifications of a data breach, what are we protecting first and foremost? Zero trust approach is primarily focused on data and the data service protections, basically the things that serve up and house these data sets and data repositories. So you've got two resources there that defend my assertion that if you're looking at a place to start, might be the data. Now, keep in mind that then we get into issues of how you do that. And as I say, this goes way beyond 20 minutes because the IT infrastructure is very broad and your data ecosystem is very, very broad. And don't be fooled by any vendor, ours or anybody else's, and say, we've got a single silver bullet that's going to give you zero trust across your entire IT infrastructure. That's not possible. It's just that no silver bullet exists. And I think it's good to not only admit that, but to simply admit that and say, that brings us back to that question, where do you start? And that becomes really crucial, knowing that you don't have a single tool that will fix the entire machinery. Where do you start? And again, I'm going to go back to that word. Probably think about the data. So if you go to the US DoD and their framework, and it's a very comprehensive framework, and who am I to question the DoD? They've done their homework, and they lay out their metaphor for zero trust using pillars. It's kind of a structural metaphor. By the way, this is my diagram, not their diagram. And I actually, being cheeky and having dealt a little bit with the US DoD, I don't mind tweaking them a little bit. I didn't like the fact that they called data a pillar. You have other pillars out there. You've got the network and the network elements, the users, you've got the devices, you've got applications, you've got things that monitor and audit and automation. Those are all part and parcel of their pillars of zero trust. And data is another pillar. And the first thing that stuck out in my mind, again, thinking about what I've just said from these other sources about the all importance of data, data isn't a pillar in this model. Data is what we will call the pediment. If you're not familiar with Greek architecture, the pediment is that very ornate part that is being supported by the pillars. So the network supports the access and transfer of data. Users use the data. Devices work with the data, but they are all in support of, and in a way, if we're talking about protection, may I say a little bit subordinate to the data. So this, in my way, is answering the question for myself as we at Comforte hold conversations. If data is what they're after, and that is all important, and everything else in your IT environment supports the data, the existence of the data, the creation of data, the transfer of data, that may be where you start, depending upon your maturity assessment. And by the way, the US DoD analysts, they all talk about, really depends upon where your organization is. But in our eyes, the data is a very logical place to narrow your thought processes in terms of where should we start. But first, I want to give a little bit of, let me change slides here. This is going to be a build slide. I hardly ever do these, but I'm going to give you a metaphor here or an example. And I'm going to say this by saying I'm a bit of an Anglophile. I've got degrees in which I studied the language, literature, and history of the British Isles. So I love it. I love a good, robust English castle. Nothing better to walk around. No offense to French, German, Spanish, or other structures of that nature. And what we're going to see here is, let me start building this, is Dover Castle. And one of the things that strikes me as I look at castles is that even way back in the Middle Ages, they're carrying out defensive postures just in the same way that our IT administrators, our CISO, and others making these decisions, they're doing the same thing. They're taking what is most important. It's usually squirreled away in the middle. You've got outer borders, you've got inner borders, and really that's what you're seeing there. And while 700-800 years ago, they had no concept of zero trust, didn't they? this whole structure is all about, we don't trust anybody coming up to this. And so we are going to build into this structure all sorts of mechanisms and barriers. And at every step of the way, we're going to create a choke point so that we can challenge and verify and you move forward, but you don't just go over the wall and get to see the king and queen. You continually go through these different perimeters, these different authentication challenges, and all sorts of other attempts. And let's say you're an attacker. So let's convert this to, we've breached the outer barriers, we've breached the inner barriers, we've gone over the moat, we've gone everywhere, and we are after the king and queen. And we are, that's, in this sense, the king and queen are like the data. That's what they're after. They even start going up this very narrow stairway to get to what it is they're after. And what happens if they get up to the throne room and they're not there? What if the king and queen were whisked away? I don't know. Think of whatever mechanism, secret, some of them had secret passages, could have disguised themselves and gotten out. Whatever the case, if you're an attacker and you're after something and you go through all of this, and yet there was some mechanism, some trick, something that took away that thing of value that you were after, was that breach successful or was it not? I'm going to contend that it wasn't. And I'm going to then explain this from a more technical perspective, which is, if this is our data, on that first row up there, Chandra Lagarinen, and we have all of the very sensitive data. By the way, this is what they are after. This is the data that the threat actors want. We can encrypt it. Encryption comes with some problems. I'm not saying encryption is bad. Encryption is fantastic. Just depends upon what thing you're applying the tool to. But if you're talking about business applications, when you start taking very sensitive data and manipulating it and it doesn't preserve the format, you have new problems. But what if you were able to take that thing, like that king and queen, the data, and you were able to whisk it away and make it benign or non-assailable? And that second row there is now format preserving tokenization. They might get to it, but they can't do anything with it. So we're not, again, talking about prevention at this point. We're talking about mitigation. But if you're able to do this, haven't you really carried out ultimately a very strong zero trust principle? If you protect your data once in your environment and your internal workers are using business applications and all they see are the protected tokenized data, and you never deprotect it, why would you if all of your business applications are natively working with it because of the format preserving encryption, and then somebody gets in from the outside and gets hands on it, or maybe it's an inside job, doesn't matter. Did the breach occur? Well, I guess. Did it have the effect? No, you can't do anything with this. So in essence, if you protect data properly, you've in essence gone straight to the heart of very granular zero trust, because you don't trust anybody with the sensitive elements of the data. So can data-centric security support zero trust? Absolutely, it can support zero trust. And I think from a very granular perspective. Now, I'm going to go quickly because I only have a few more minutes. One attempt is to segment your network and segment and segment and micro segment and micro segment. This is a very expensive proposition. So now I'm just comparing protecting data to protecting the networks and zoning them off and micro segmenting. The larger your enterprise to a multi-global, your costs are going to go up exponentially or near exponentially. But to get a similar level of granularity, as I just showed you, you're going to be talking about far less of an expenditure and far less complexity. I can back this up with a customer that we have who spent 1/3 of the costs. They were about to do network segmentation, but instead start with the data. And don't necessarily put off micro segmentation, but if you're looking for a low-hanging fruit, they're after your data. So start with applying data-centric protection and 1/3 of the cost with other savings. And so again, where do you start? Doesn't protecting the data then serve as a logical starting point? There's more to it than that, by the way. any data-centric platform can not only protect the data, but you have to find it. You have to understand it. Where is it? It's in the cloud. It may be in SaaS applications. It may be on-premise. You have to find it. You have to know it, understand it, label it. And so it's even more than just protecting it with the right controls. In this case, I was showing you tokenization. It's, can you find it, gather it all together, understand it, label it, and then apply the right controls? That's what data-centric security can do. And again, all toward that highly granular denying of implicit trust to anybody trying to access that protected data. Key takeaways, and I'm going to land it right here. This is a change in thinking. It's more of a philosophical change and maybe even an organizational cultural change. But at the end of it, you're talking about eliminating implicit trust. Just because somebody logs in doesn't mean that they should have access unfettered to everything. So how do you then carry that out? You can micro-segment, you can do things with your IAM, you can do lots of things. But remember, data is the target. To me, it's not a pillar in that model. It is the crowning structure of it. So maybe if the organization is thinking, where do we start? Think about data-centric security first. It's not all inclusive, but it gives you that level, that very granular level of protection, and it applies the protection to the thing threat actors are after. And I yield the floor. Do I still have people with me?
Any questions for Trevor? Doesn't look like it, Trevor.
Well, I want to say one more thing, Colin. I appreciate everybody's attention to that. I realize I took a particular vantage point. You're going to hear others on Zero Trust. It's a very comprehensive topic. We're always glad to talk about it, but our focus is on the data. But hopefully this did what I asked and just makes you think about this and start thinking about it from that philosophical sense that the US DoD suggests. But thank you all for your participation.
Thank you. Everybody return to the main room now. Thank you.